Howdy, so for science we're looking at photosynthesis and anaerobic respiration. So today we're going to talk about photosynthesis and anaerobic respiration, so the two types of fermentation. So that's what we're going to focus on today. So today we're going to start by looking at photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process that autotrophs use to use sunlight to make sugars that then they can break down later on. So light energy comes into the plant, in this case. Carbon dioxide and water are the chemicals that are involved. The light energy breaks up the carbon dioxide and water and produces sugar, and as a product you get oxygen. And oxygen is important because that's what we breathe. So photosynthesis is the basis of almost all life processes on Earth. There are some weird organisms that don't have photosynthesis in their food chain, but generally speaking most do. So pretty much everything either is a plant, eats plants, or eats something that eats plants. That's going to cover most of the organisms on Earth. The reason that is the plants generate the sugar, the other organisms eat the plants to get the sugar, and then other organisms eat those organisms to get their sugar. And it just passes through food chains like that. So like I said, photosynthesis, it uses energy from the sun to make sugar in plants. We're going to focus on plants. It does happen in other organisms, but we're just going to look at plants because they're the easiest ones to talk about. The oxygen that we have in the atmosphere is a result of photosynthesis. The early Earth didn't have much oxygen, and when the evolution of photosynthesis came around, it caused a bit of a hassle because the increase in oxygen concentration killed off an awful lot of organisms. Oxygen is quite toxic, and the organisms weren't ready for the oxygen, so one of the great extinctions on Earth is thought to be linked to the evolution of photosynthesis. So today we're going to focus on plants, which are eukaryotic organisms, but photosynthesis can occur in prokaryotic organisms as well. They just happen in different places. So in prokaryotic organisms, the photosynthesis happens in the cytoplasm of the cell, just floating around. The chemicals are there ready to go, and the enzymes that do the process are ready to go too. In eukaryotic organisms, it happens in the chloroplasts of plants. So chloroplasts are these structures here. They're membrane-bound organelles, similar to mitochondria in many ways. One way is they used to be free-living bacteria, and then they merged with plant cells quite some time ago. So chloroplasts contain a pigment called chlorophyll. There are several different types of chlorophyll. Usually they're green, and I'll talk about why that is in a second. The chlorophyll is important because this is the chemical that is capturing the light energy and using that light energy to produce energy in another source which can be used to make the sugars. So generally chlorophylls are green because they absorb light energy that's blue and red and reflect the green, so that's why they look green. This is an accident of evolution. Chlorophyll being green, that's handy in the ocean because the light wavelengths that penetrate into the ocean are kind of your very high energy blue and then some of your red. It's not as handy up on the surface. On the surface you can get green light energy as well. It'd be great to have a black pigment almost that could absorb all the colours of the spectrum, and that would generate more energy. But that's just how evolution happened. It started in the ocean, so we get these green pigments instead. There are other pigments other than chlorophyll that can be used, and that's why you can get different coloured leaves in plants, for example. It's just the different amount of chlorophyll or different types of chlorophyll that gives you that different colour on the leaves. So here's the important bit, the equation for photosynthesis. So we've got carbon dioxide and water reacting to produce glucose and oxygen. This is essentially the reverse of the aerobic respiration formula. In the aerobic respiration formula, breaking down glucose in the presence of oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and water, this process goes the other way. So carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is absorbed into plants, water is absorbed through the roots. The energy to join these bits together to make the sugar comes from the sun, and you get your glucose and oxygen. The oxygen is this byproduct, this waste product almost, that is then emitted out into the atmosphere. Again, it's a very complicated pathway, and I'm not going to go through it in any detail. It's not just a single reaction, it's many, many, many reactions that go together to produce it. So where these reactions happen in the chloroplast depend on what part of the reaction that we're looking at. And like I said, there's quite a complicated process that I'm not going to go into. There's one process that requires light, and there's one process that doesn't require light. There's lots of different enzymes that are involved, and it's quite complex. But the end process is a fairly simple equation. So the carbon dioxide reacts with water to produce glucose and oxygen. So the glucose produced from photosynthesis, as well as other sugars that are produced by the manipulation of glucose, are very important for plants. One thing is they store energy, so the glucose can be used and broken down straight away to produce energy for the plants. But the plants can join glucose molecules together to make other molecules. So down here we have starch. Starch is made of lots of glucoses joined together, and that's how plants can store their energy if they don't need it straight away. When we're eating a vegetable, we're eating the starchy bit of the vegetable. So if it's a potato, it's the root. For celery, it's the stalk. If it's spinach, it's the leaves. That's where the starch is being stored. So about half the sugar produced by a plant in photosynthesis is used for energy. The rest is used to make the plant. So the cell walls of plants are made up of cellulose. Cellulose is an arrangement of glucose, so it's lots of sugars joined together in a slightly different way than the starch is down here. So these sugars are very, very important for plants because they're used both for energy and to make the structures that make plants up. Now we're going to talk about anaerobic respiration. There's two types of anaerobic respiration. One produces alcohol, which we're going to talk about first, and the other one produces lactic acid. So anaerobic respiration occurs when you don't have enough oxygen to break down the sugar molecules completely. So you can partially break down the glucose, but you don't break it down all the way. So that means you get much less energy being produced, because to get all the energy out of the glucose, you need to make it into really small molecules, carbon dioxide and water. This way you make slightly larger molecules. Both of these processes are called fermentation, and there's two types. There's lactic acid fermentation and ethanol fermentation. So alcohol fermentation, or ethanol fermentation, happens in plants, yeast and bacteria. The glucose is broken down partially to produce ethanol and carbon dioxide. So here's ethanol here, C2H5OH. So the glucose is broken down into ethanol, and two carbon dioxide molecules come out with a small amount of energy. This isn't the only type of respiration that can be performed, but it's only produced when you have very low oxygen levels available. We use this a lot, alcohol fermentation. We use it to make our alcohols like beers and so on. So in beer you combine yeast with hops and another starch source, so a glucose source, so like a wheat or barley. You heat it up, you remove oxygen from the process, you get a fermentation happening, and you get bubbles of carbon dioxide being produced, and that's the bubbles in your beer, and you get ethanol produced, and that's the alcohol that you're drinking alcohol. The problem with this process is the ethanol that's produced, ethanol is quite toxic. It will eventually kill the cells producing it, so you can only get to a certain level of alcohol in your mix before you kill off the yeast cells that are doing the job. So one of the jobs of a brewer is to manage the level of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and also the temperatures and so on to make sure that the yeast don't die. We also use yeast in baking. So yeast is a fungus that can do this process. We use it in baking. It's how we make dough rise. It's where the bubbles in our crumpets come from. That's the yeast producing the carbon dioxide from the sugar. And they also produce ethanol, but the ethanol just evaporates away, so you don't get drunk when you eat bread. The second type of fermentation is called lactic acid fermentation, and that occurs in animals like us. So if you can't get enough oxygen into your muscle cells, for example, you can do this lactic acid fermentation to break down sugar and release some energy that your muscles can still use. The number of ATPs you get produced is fewer, so you only get 2 ATPs produced per molecule of glucose versus 38 in aerobic respiration. So it's a very, very low energy process, but it's still handy to keep you running if you're trying to run away from something, for example. So here's the equation down here. So we've got glucose producing lactic acid and energy. The lactic acid just cut the glucose in half. So C6H12O6 goes to C3H6O3. So 3 is half of 6, 6 is half of 12. So that's the way that I remember this equation. Why is this important? Like I said, sometimes you just can't get enough oxygen to all the cells in your body if you're running away from a lion or a tiger, for example, or if you're in a race, I guess, in more peaceful times. So you still need to break down sugar in your cells so that the cells will move, and therefore your muscles will move, and therefore you can run away. But you can't get enough oxygen in there, so this is a way of doing it. Your body can break down the lactic acid later to get the energy back, but that's when you're not running anymore, and you can breathe more oxygen, get some more oxygen into your body to break down those leftover lactic acid molecules. The lactic acid produced is quite poisonous, and this is why, if you do a lot of exercise, your muscles can hurt sometimes. It's the lactic acid damaging the cells, so then your cells have to reproduce. So that's it. So lactic acid fermentation happens in animals. It can happen in some bacteria as well. That's how we get yogurt, but mainly we're going to focus on it happening in us. So today on Flipping Science, we looked at photosynthesis, ethanol fermentation, and lactic acid fermentation. That's it for Flipping Science today. See ya.